In this video, I'm going to be building the Meng World War II's Char B1. And this video is going to be a little bit different. I'm James and you're watching LPJ Models. Let's rewind back to 2017. I'd recently got back into the hobby and wanted to get my work out there, so I wrote a few articles for a few magazines. And this was my very first article. I wanted to ease in with something simple, and that happened to be a Toon tank. And I've always wanted to pay homage to my first entry into the model publishing sphere. So with this cool little kit sent in by Rico, thank you by the way, I'm going to do just that. Now these Toon tanks are a fairly simple affair. There aren't many parts to them, and the details are nice and chunky, so it's likely that you won't lose any tiny parts. And they are an accessible entry point into the hobby. My partner Sophie made this KV2 back in 2021, and did a really good job of it, I might add. So I'm going to get to it with this Toon tank build, and it'll be a nice breath of fresh air between big projects. So let's get the parts off the sprue and get building. Well, these things practically build themselves anyway. Huh? What's going on? And with probably the quickest build section on my channel ever, let's crack on with the rest of the model. Now this kit is going to need one or two tiny improvements before I get any paint on. Firstly, let's address these rubber band tracks. While they're okay and they do the job, well, for me, they don't quite cut the mustard. So as I'm improving my Fusion 360 skill set almost on the daily, I designed myself some workable track links. There was a little bit of trial and error when it came to designing these, mostly to do with how they connected to each other. The first draft had a really rudimentary Lego hand ball and socket style joint, and this was a bit rubbish because it didn't have a full range of movement up and down, and if there were any sideways motions when I was assembling the tracks, they'd just fall to pieces. The second revision had a pin and socket style joint, but these proved to be too shallow and brittle. The pins and the ends kept snapping off. So these were widened, and this happened. Somehow my raft glitched and I ended up with 5mm of raft, completely swamping the newest design. It was a bit of a waste of resin, but it also was pretty funny. Sometimes with 3D printing, these things happen. I reoriented them and reprinted them, and they came out great. The support removal was really easy, considering I used 0.1mm support. Literally, they just snapped off. And they came out looking pretty nice too. These were printed on my Saturn IV Ultra. And like I wanted, they snapped together. Overall, with revisions, the design time took about 1 hour 15 minutes. And each of my 4 set of prints took about 50 minutes each time. So it wasn't a huge time investment for a massive payoff. If you want these, you can find them on my Cults 3D page. Just search Les Paul James. I did test them by putting them on the tank just to make sure they fit perfectly, although I did work to measurements. And apart from the final link being quite tricky to click together, I was pretty pleased. The next thing I'm going to do is not strictly an upgrade, but it should add some more visual interest to the model. I added some texture with some Mr. Surfacer 1500 and an old tatty brush. Because I didn't have any of the thicker stuff, I left some of this to dry slightly, so it was really thick and goopy, and it was just dabbed onto the surface. This was also repeated on the exhaust pipes, just for a bit more variety. Once this was dry, I went over it with some sanding sponge just to smooth any really rough edges. I also wanted it to be nice and subtle. And with that, it's time to get on with the painting. The whole paint job was started with a layer of Mr. Surfacer 1500 Grey. Now, I haven't got a conventional paint scheme lined up for this build. I'm going to go with something a bit more exciting, and something that you don't see very often. I've seen it on Gundams, I've seen it on figures, but I don't think I've seen one of these painted up before to look like it's in a cartoon. So I'm really going to run with that cartoon theme for the vehicle, and hopefully learn some new cool techniques along the way. The first colour to go down on this model was Tamiya LP16 Deck Tan. This is going to be my kind of mid-tone for the vehicle. So I laid over a few light coats, and because I'd thinned this before, it wasn't very opaque, so I had to go over it several times to build up to opacity. I also didn't have much of this colour left, so I was hoping to get everything done with what I had. And luckily, I just about managed it. I then started to add some shading in, and this time I used Tamiya's regular dark yellow too. This was thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner. The paint was painted on the undersurfaces, and also any surfaces that weren't directly pointing up. One or two sections received a slight graduation, but that's mostly going to be hidden anyway. As I was blocking in some major colours, I also painted the tracks at this stage. I mixed in some MRP RLM66 with some black. I wanted them to kind of be a dark grey, almost like a Panzer grey. I also had to make sure to move the tracks to make sure I got into all the nooks and crannies. I didn't want any of that resin to show through. And to protect them, as they were probably going to be handled a lot, I sealed them in with some VMS matte varnish. The matte surface will also make it easier to paint on later. I mixed up a really rusty tone using MRP Marking Red, Tamiya Lemon Yellow, and a touch of black. I wanted this to be nice and vibrant, and this mix was sprayed all over the exhausts. And then it was time to paint the camouflage on this French tank. I used two main shades for each colour. AK 3rd Gen Red Brown and AK 3rd Gen Very Dark Brown were to be the highlights and the shadows for my brown sections. And initially I was going to use olive base uniform and dark olive green for my green sections, but I ended up using dark olive green and olive drab. These were popped on my wet palette and slightly thinned with VMS airbrush thinner, just to make them flow a little better. And I got to painting. The camouflage shapes were blocked in with the browns and the greens, and they did need around 3 coats of each to build it up to a decent opacity. To make sure I had enough paint on my brush to paint large sections, I used an Artist Opus Series S in a size of 2. That made covering up these large areas pain-free. And like with all good sable brushes, they hold a lot of paint. Here you can see I've painted the lighter colours on the upper facing surfaces and the darker colours on anything that doesn't point directly up, at least on the top of the hull. For the sponsoring covers, I painted the darker colours on the recessed areas and the brighter colours on the parts that stuck out. And like I said before, everything needed several coats. Before we start putting the Toon in our Toon tank, I'm going to unify the entire surface of the model with some VMS matte varnish. The camo looks pretty blotchy, and I need to make the paint more durable because it's going to get handled a lot. So one fairly moderate coat of matte varnish was sprayed over the entire tank. Once this was done and the finish was unified, I left it aside to dry for about 40 minutes. And because I have fairly shaky hands, for the next step I'm going to need one of these. This is not one of the brush types or felt types, it's actually a fine line pen. And because this is going to be done in a Toon style, we're going to need some outlines. I meticulously drew around every detail on the tank. And this is just the first step. One thing I was worried about with this pen is because it's a fine liner, it has a very small aperture in which the ink flows out the bottom of the pen. And drawing over a painted surface, well, that makes it quite likely that it's going to pick up particles of paint and clog up. And it only took about 5 minutes of use before this started to happen. To try and help this, I had a small pot of alcohol to the side, and every now and again I dip the pen in the pot of alcohol and give it a good shake just to dislodge any of those paint particles. And it kinda worked. Maybe if the surface wasn't matte, I might have had an easier time. But not to worry. I think one of the keys too is not to apply too much pressure. More pressure equals more scrapey paint. And that's all the outlining done. It's starting to take shape. I was a bit dubious when jumping into this paint scheme because I'd never done anything like it before. And the next part is going to be trickier. I'm going to have to paint on some impressionistic highlights and shadows without it looking too contrived. Good luck to me. For these, I'm going to use a mix of AK 3rd Gen and Vallejo Model Color colours. I'm not going to rattle off all the names, but if you want to know exactly what I used, you can pause the screen right about now. And these were all popped into my wet palette. Because I'm very disorganised, I didn't do this in any particular order. I did, however, start with the light greens and the highlights on the turret. I'm usually a fussy and meticulous painter, so this was a nice change of pace. I used some broad, bold brushstrokes to add highlights, and I tried to lay them down in a kind of sketchy style. Placing the shadows and highlights took a little bit of guesswork and rough approximation, obviously with the light source in mind, but I still had to think carefully and kind of plan what I was going to do. I used varying shades of the highlights and shadows to give the impression that this was more 3D in a painterly way. I found rough edge highlights to be one of the most effective methods of showing this. It also really helped to separate the highlight planes from the shadow planes. And with all those shadows and highlights painted, it was time to move on to the thing that would tie the whole build together. We've done the outlining, but now I need to draw on accent lines and details. This was even trickier than deciding where the highlights and shadows were to go. Well, not the highlights and shadows, but you know what I mean, the last step. And it also proved that I definitely don't have a steady hand. A lot of my lines are really wobbly, but I do think that adds to the vibe of the piece. And with all these lines and little crosshatches, it's really starting to come to life. I couldn't forget the tools, they needed to be painted in. They were done in pretty much the same manner as before. The tool handles were painted with Vallejo Old Wood and highlighted with a flesh tone, and the metal items themselves were painted a grey-black and highlighted with a lighter grey. The exhaust pipes were given a few swipes of bright orange. I'll add textures and lines later. And the exhaust covers were popped carefully on top. One of the things that worried me the most was the painting of the tracks. It just seemed a bit daunting because the details were a bit fussier than that on the rest of the vehicle. So I kept it simple. Each raised area of the metal track was painted with a lighter grey. This was just to simulate some shine and add some volume to the tracks. And then for the first and last time on this build, I used some oil paints to make a wash. It was going to be painstaking to draw around every single detail on this set of tracks, so I just went with a black wash. I used some Absalon 502 black oils, mixed with some VMS Universal Weathering Carrier to thin it, and some VMS Oil Expert to make it dry quicker. When I'd I'd done the entire wash, to clean off those raised track areas, I just turned it around and wiped it on the piece of paper. Et voila! The tracks, once dry, were then manhandled carefully onto the tank. I still had to be really careful because 3D resin can be brittle, so while they are a bit better than my previous revisions to the design, I still need to take a bit of care. And with some careful manoeuvring and pinching, I got them on. I then had to add some drawing lines to the tracks just on the visible areas to accentuate those shadows and keep it in with the cartoon theme. The aerial was then popped in place. Oh, you can see glue in the background. I did use glue in this build, but I didn't think it was important to show it, because these kits can be built without. I painted up some super rusty spare tracks and glued these on the front. I decided to use my parts instead of the kit parts, just for continuity. Because these didn't have a locating pin, I used some super glue. The turret was then finally popped in place. You can also see the two jerry cans on the back. I painted these with red and panzer grey. It's not overly noticeable, but you can see some sheen from the pen lines and from areas that I'd painted after my last layer of varnish. So to tie everything together, to make it look matte and 2D, I'm going to finish off with another layer of VMS matte varnish. I gave the tank a quick dust with a stiff brush and then sprayed it on. And with that final layer of varnish, the build was complete. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my patrons for supporting my work. Your support is much appreciated. And I'd also like to say a huge thanks to Rico for sending me this kit. I really enjoyed building this model in a completely different style to normal. In the world of historical miniatures, it's not often we get to play around. And because I had a bit more freedom, I had a right blast. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Also, please don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos. I'm really close to 50k and I'm really excited about that. So thanks to those of you who have already subscribed, but if you haven't, press that button. Anyway, I'll leave you with the final gallery images. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thank you for watching.